This is an event we look forward to at the conclusion of each session, because as conservatives, we're glad that government has gone home. We say that with the utmost respect of each of the elected officials, including those with whom we disagree. Because one of the things you know about the foundation is that our conclusions on policies and our lobbying for those policies is based on academic quality research that actually is better than what most people who are tenured professors do, although that's another topic. And secondly, being serious, we really do try to model civil discourse, including when we disagree with others. And so you know, if you come to our events, that we're extremely grateful for everyone attending. What we want to do for the people of Texas and the people of America is make sure that we're having an honest debate about the major policy issues of the day, and that part of that debate is asking good questions, referring to our research, and then going out and fighting for what's right. So one of the things you know about the foundation, too, is that we don't shy away from hard policy fights. So let me say that I'll give you a little bit of an overview of our perspective on the legislative session, and then more importantly, I will turn this over to 5 policy experts whom I will introduce here momentarily. We are, if you look at the 85th Texas Legislature, taking stock of what happened and what didn't happen. And I really do mean it, speaking from someone who loves the free market and is a movement conservative, that it's good that we have a part-time legislature. It's also good, on the whole, that bills, a majority of bills filed, are not passed. This year, this session, this legislature passed a historically low percentage of bills. And you can decide for yourself if that's good or that's bad. On average, since statehood, the Texas legislature has sent about 25% of its filed bills to the governor. This year, about 18% went to Governor Abbott. Now, as conservatives, and I'm thinking about the broad sweep of several hundred years of the conservative movement, we probably should be happy. Not that government intrinsically is evil, it's not. Government intrinsically reflects the people. So if we're saying government intrinsically is evil, we're saying something about ourselves. I would like, as our founding fathers and the founders of this great state thought, that people are virtuous. And yet, what we're trying to undo here in Texas, and in Washington, D.C. for that matter, is 75 years of the dependency state, in which government has become so large and overreach has become so extensive that human persons cannot think for themselves. I do not mean that in a derogatory way at all. I mean that out of the Christian love and charity that we have for one another. So the work that we do here, each of the 5 policy areas you will hear updates on today, is imbued with that spirit that what we do here at the foundation, the reason we work so hard 2 blocks north and beyond, is because of our love for everyone. And because we believe that conservative free market principles, which are the permanent things of human existence, are best implemented in Texas, and that can best be implemented in Washington once they've been implemented in a state like ours. So there is a collective pride about that, about this work, and I think you're going to hear that from each of our analysts today. The implications of the session on conservative policies, frankly, are mixed. And again, we say that being a nonpartisan research institute first and foremost. There are policy victories that folks who generally agree with us can claim. There are policy defeats that folks who agree with us can share with us. But while we are purists, I think that's one of the things that people on both sides of the spectrum would say about our foundation. We also understand that in order to undo 75 years of wrong-headed policies takes some incremental reform. And the Ronald Reagan principle of taking what you can get this session in order to move the battle line forward for the next session is something that you will hear today. Not that ideally we wouldn't want the whole enchilada to begin with. And we've gotten the whole enchilada on some of our reforms. But I'm here to tell you today that in spite of the fact that only 18% of the filed bills this session went to the governor, and in spite of the fact that on some of our key priorities as conservative free market types, we didn't achieve victory, we're not going anywhere. In fact, we're not going to wait until January 2019 to be active. We have already started planning for the next session. We do that because of people like you. I think most of you here are great supporters of the foundation. I know looking around the room, some of you work on issues opposite us, and that's fine. I am genuinely grateful that you're here. We look forward to Q&A that follows. So with all of that said, let me remind you, please, of a couple of things. Please be sure that your cell phones are silenced. We are recording this for the whole world to see, so the handful of you who are here who work on issues opposite us, we invite you to ask questions so we can explain why our position's right. And secondly, regardless of which side of the spectrum you're on, if you need to take an environmental break, the men's room and the ladies' room are behind us, so you would venture that way on your left and head up that side of the room. With that said, let me introduce our analysts. You will be very pleased to hear from each of them. First up, and I'll introduce them all before inviting each of them one at a time to come to the podium. Dr. Vance Ginn is a very proud Texas Tech Red Raider. He earned his, in spite of their baseball loss last night, I'm sorry about that,
Did
Vance.
Texas win?
No, sir, they did not. But we're still Texas.
Okay.
With all of that said, let me say with great pride on Vance's behalf that he has a PhD in economics from Texas Tech. He is one of the great up-and-coming conservative free market economists in this country. We are proud that he serves this foundation in the Center for Fiscal Policy. You will hear from him about the budget and fiscal policy. After Vance, we have Mr. James Quintero, one of the longest tenured members of our TPPF team, director of the Center for Local Governance, and perhaps most importantly, a fellow Longhorn. Another fellow Longhorn, you see, we make very good judgments here at TPPF. Mrs. Stephanie Matthews, a longtime advocate for children in the realm of education freedom, a center that she has helmed this session, that she will continue to helm for us. We are very proud of the work that Stephanie and her team, all of whom are here today, did this session. You will get some good prognostication from Stephanie regarding what's ahead in 2019. After we hear our education update, one of our other PhDs, which means that we're not really all that smart, we just know how to read, Dr. Derek Cohen, recently minted PhD in criminology from the University of Cincinnati, serves very, very capably as our deputy director of the Center for Effective Justice. Derek will talk to us about what happened and didn't happen in Texas and look forward beyond that. And concluding our center analysis this afternoon will be Brandon Logan, one of our newest team members here. Brandon is both an Aggie and a Red Raider. I do have to allow my Aggie friends some celebration for moving forward to the Super Regionals. Having said that, it really was painful. But more importantly, Brandon has just been a stellar addition to the Foundation's team. He directs our newest center, the Center for Families and Children. He has been an outstanding, important, pivotal person in the beginning of foster care reform here in Texas, and so we're proud to have him aboard. I know you will enjoy hearing from him. Having introduced all of these great folks, I will introduce the first, and that's Dr. Ginn.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. It was too bad to see both UT and Tech losing yesterday in the baseball tournament. A&M, I guess, continues to go on. I still don't have to like them, but either way. Thank you all for being here. Let me turn to the next slide. So I work in the Center for Fiscal Policy here at the Foundation. Been here for almost 4 years. Have the privilege of working with the great and honorable Talmadge Heflin, who many of you know and has been around for a long time and has tutored me in a lot of ways on conservative fiscal policy that we practice here at the Foundation. And when we think about what is conservative fiscal policy, the question that comes to mind to me is, what is the role of government, right? So if I asked you, took a poll in here, what the role of government is, many of you would have different answers. Ultimately, the first one that comes to my mind, maybe to many of yours, is to preserve liberty, right? Now, that can get into a debate about, well, what are we preserving? Which liberties are we preserving, and so forth. But when you look at our state budget, the budget indicates the priorities of the legislature, which, as Kevin said, is reflective of what the people want, right? So when you look at our $217 billion budget, 75% of that goes to two sectors. Which sectors do you think? What's one of them? Education and healthcare, right? Those are the main two. And so when we're looking at these, we have to see, okay, how fast should they grow by, right? So it's preserving liberty, but these expenditures must be paid for. So every dollar that's spent by the legislature, they don't have, none of these trees around the Capitol, at least that I've found so far, grow money. Have any of you found any? And if we do, we need to go out there right now. The money that they use comes from taxpayers. All of us. When you pay sales tax, other taxes that come in, that's how we pay for government expenditures. So for every dollar that we must spend, we must make sure that those dollars are spent effectively and efficiently so we can keep the burden on taxpayers from growing an excessive amount. And so one of our key legislative items that we've been in favor of here at the foundation is to pass a conservative spending limit. Basically, to make sure that government doesn't grow too fast, that it doesn't excessively burden taxpayers. We understand that there is a role for government, so government's going to increase, the government spending is going to increase at some rate. But let's make sure that that footprint doesn't strangle the private sector, the productive economy that we have here in the great state of Texas. And so when you look at the spending limit that we have in the state, the constitutional spending limit, that the base of what it covers of overall spending is on general revenue not dedicated by the Constitution. So basically what the legislators have the most discretion over. Well, that's only about 45% of the overall budget. Less than half is covered underneath this spending limit. And the rate, the metric that's used to restrain the growth in government is by personal income, right? So you take the total personal income in the state and see how much that grows by, and that's the metric that's used, whether or not that's the best indicator or not. And then which data are used to see what that metric is going to be, what rate of growth? Well, we use a forecast over the next 2 fiscal years from when we're writing that budget that ends up being almost 3 years of an estimate, of a forecast. Some of my more academic research looks at energy prices and how energy prices move and whether or not we can forecast gasoline and diesel prices. And as you might guess, it's difficult to predict what gas, oil, diesel prices are going to do a week from now, much less a $1.7 trillion economy over the next 3 years. It's practically impossible, right? But that's what we use with our current spending limit. And what it does is it doesn't really restrain the footprint of government, which is not just 45% of the budget, but is the entire budget, right? The total budget. And so we've looked at here at the foundation, it says, let's change that base from 45% to the total budget, state funds and federal funds. Some will argue that, well, the legislators don't really have control over federal funds, but they do, right? They have control in the sense that they have to appropriate dollars, which will then be matched, whether it's education spending, whether it's Medicaid, it's going to be matched with federal funds. So there is some control that's there, and that's really the footprint of government. Then you see which metrics should we use? Well, the research really shows that population growth plus inflation really best reflects what taxpayers' ability to pay or their burden over time for funding government with taxpayer dollars. So why would you use population plus inflation? Well, as more people move to the state, maybe there's a reason to increase government spending for education, healthcare, and other items, so you have population growth in there. And then you look at inflation. Well, we're not measuring what inflation is by what the government spends. Some would argue that we need to have an inflation metric for transportation, healthcare, and so forth. But who is the main driver of those markets? It's not consumers and suppliers, it's the government. So if you have a metric that's being matched by what the government force is put in place, they can drive up the price whatever they want. And so that makes it not a very useful or efficient indicator. So use inflation based on the CPI that best matches wages growth by taxpayers over time. And so what you see is that is able to provide some measure of the burden of government over time and allows it to grow at some level. Now, I can make a good case that government shouldn't grow at all. And in fact, with having population plus inflation increases over time, that assumes that the level, the base that we have today is the correct amount. But if you go back to 04-05 budget, to the 16-17 budget, the current budget, the government spending is up 11.8% above population growth plus inflation. So that argues to me that we're already way above what the base should be. But for a practical matter, let's look at population growth plus inflation over time as a good way to restrain spending and the burden on taxpayers. And then finally, let's look at actual data. Instead of a forecast on personal income, let's use actual data of population plus inflation over the last 2 fiscal years. And that's really the impetus that's helped us to define what a conservative Texas budget is, which I'll get into in a minute. And so with those metrics in place, there was Senate Bill 9 that was passed by the Senate this session. Unfortunately, it wasn't heard in House Appropriations, but there is movement afoot to really restrain the growth of government moving forward so the burden on all of us, taxpayers, doesn't grow too fast. And what Senate Bill 9 would have done would have expanded the base from 45% to 55%, so it'd be general revenue plus general revenue dedicated. Didn't get as far as we want to the whole budget, but it starts getting in that direction. And then you also have the metric that was used was population times inflation, not plus inflation, but that's also closer to what we'd like to see. And then finally, it uses an average of the last 2 fiscal years and the upcoming fiscal years. So we're heading in the right direction. Unfortunately, we didn't make it past the goal line there. If we can limit the growth rate of government, we can continue to cut back on our tax burden. And the most burdensome tax that we have in the state, besides the local level and property tax, which James is going to get into in a minute, is the business franchise tax. It's a costly tax. It's very complex. Oftentimes, it costs a business more to comply with the tax than to pay the tax. And so we've all been long advocated for getting rid of the franchise tax entirely. There were several bills this session that would have headed in the right direction. Senate Bill 17 over in the Senate and House Bill 28 in the House. Both of those would put in place a trigger that says if there was a certain amount of revenue available, they would use the additional amount of revenue, like if there's an available fund balance or a surplus, to cut the franchise tax each session until it was eliminated. And we were strong supporters of both of those. Unfortunately, both of those failed in the House and in the Senate in their respective committees. And so while those were good ideas, and I think we've made some progress there, again, we didn't reach the finish line. But I've got some wins, though, to talk about, some things here at the end. And what we've talked about is conservative Texas budget to where the increase in the budget doesn't grow by more than population plus inflation. When you look at the budget, the way that it's reported, it shows $216.8 billion over the biennium, over a 2-year period. And the Legislative Budget Board shows that that's an increase of 0.2%. And that if you measure it for population plus inflation, it's down 7.6%. There's some problems with that. The key one is that it's not an apples-to-apples comparison. What they compare is the estimated expenditures for 16-17, the current biennium, with what was appropriated for 18-19, right? So you have an expenditure, larger amount, to what was initially appropriated, okay, and tries to compare those two. So it's not an apples-to-apples comparison. And what we at the Texas Public Policy Foundation say is that we need an apples-to-apples comparison. So if you have appropriations right now for 18-19, we should compare them to what was appropriated in 16-17. And when you compare those two at stage 1 of this process, you get an increase of 4.52%, right? Which was just slightly above what our metric was at 4.5%. It's about $45 million above a conservative budget, but it's a step in the right direction. Because the next stage of this will be when we have a supplemental bill to backfill what was underfunded in the 18-19 budget. Then we can compare appropriations supplementals to appropriations plus supplemental and see where we're at then. But this definitely was on the right track of a conservative budget. And then when you look at the 16-17 budget, they passed a supplemental bill this session that backfilled for Medicaid a pretty large amount of almost $1 billion. And so that allows us another comparison at stage 2 of this 2016-17 budget. And we find there is that they were below population growth plus inflation. This is the first true conservative Texas budget that we've had in years, if not decades. And so with doing that, we're able to limit the footprint of government, And with this second session of potentially the conservative budget for the 18-19, we would have a historic 2 consecutive conservative Texas budgets. And what that does is starts laying the foundation for limiting the growth rate of government over time and getting us to what we really want is a spending limit based on these metrics. And finally, these institutional frameworks that are put in place, limiting the growth rate of government, having to make sure we have an effective, efficient government that's in place, allows for the institutional framework to really matter. And so what I provided here, it's real short, different economic rankings. When you look at the United States, Texas, and basically the 4 largest states, Florida, California, New York, when you look at economic indicators, Texas wins, right? The blue are the ones that are top, the red are the worst in each one of these metrics. When you look at the unemployment rate, Texas has the lowest average over a longer period. Some will say, well, California has a lower unemployment rate right now than Texas, which they do. But that's in 1 year, or sorry, that's in 1 month, a couple months. Texas has had an unemployment rate below 5% or below for 34 consecutive months. No other state can say that. That's powerful. And to me, unemployment rate's not even a very good measure, but some economists like to look at that. Employment to population ratio, income inequality, I could go down the list. But we must make sure that the Texas model, we do not become complacent, and that we continue to build on that, because if we don't, we will lose out. Florida just moved to number 2 in the Economic Freedom North America Index because of some of the reforms they've made there, and Texas remained at 3rd. So there were some great wins this session, especially when you look at the conservative Texas budget. There are some things that we need to move forward in the 2019 legislative session. And overall, I'm excited about what's happening in Texas and for the future of our great state. So with that, I'll turn it over to James Quintero in the Center for Local Governance. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ginn. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm James Quintero. I'm the director of the Center for Local Governance, or as my good friend and colleague, Dr. Tom Lindsay likes to call it, the Center for Loco Governance, which I think, after having done this now a few years, is very appropriate. I want to thank everyone for being so generous with their time. I know that for a lot of people, session hasn't really ended. It's merely just been put on pause. And so I want to thank you for being so generous and coming out and joining us today. I want to talk a little bit about the good, the bad, and the unfinished. So if any of you were around for the last legislative session, what I thought conservatives did really well was ignite a conversation on the proper role and context of local control and how that's viewed in juxtaposition to local liberty and what those two themes mean within the realm of public policy making. And it was from that debate 2 years ago that I think another great conversation on local control erupted this session and really served as the backdrop for everything we did, from property tax to local debt to economic regulation. Really, local control and our view of it was at the center of each conversation. And so I thought we did a really good job challenging the misconception that local control is a blank check. It is not. Now, what's interesting to me is always gauging the reaction from the opposition and seeing how some of these arguments infiltrate their own sphere and how they respond to that. And I have some good friends at the Texas Municipal League. Honest to goodness, I do. One of them is even an old professor of mine. And they are, of course, one of the preeminent local lobbying powers that exist at the legislature, very well respected. And so this is what they said in their latest newsletter, which was published last week. It says, if 2015 was the year that local control began to lose its luster as a governing principle among some state leaders, which, by the way, was our first outing as a Center for Local Governance, the 2017 legislative session saw the culmination of this unfortunate trend. The new improved mantra at the Capitol is liberty. Now, I think that's a really important point, that is being identified by TML is that there's a paradigm shift occurring at the Capitol among our state leaders, and I think it's being ushered in by groups and organizations like ours. We are challenging some of these preconceived notions about what it means, what the tension is that exists between state and local leaders. I think for far too long we've, as a movement, deferred local control too much and too often. And so really it's through the lens of liberty that I see one of our biggest achievements as being the preemption of local ride-sharing regulations. Now, what's happened at the local level, and it's very obvious here in Austin, but it's very obvious elsewhere too, in Houston, Corpus Christi, Galveston, I believe Dallas had some issues. You have entrenched special interest groups manipulating the levers of government to effectively force out the competition. And so what happened here in Austin is that you have your taxi cab industry who, used the Austin City Council to pass some very onerous ride-sharing regulations, which made it so difficult for groups like Uber and Lyft to operate that they said, you know what, guys, we can't do it. We're not going to operate within the city limits. And so it's those kinds of economic regulations that I think need to be challenged at the state legislative level so that we can establish a low and predictable regulatory environment to encourage competition, to encourage innovation, and so that we can push back against some of the bad things that are happening. And so with that, the legislature, I thought, did a good job pushing forward a bill, HB 100, which established a low, uniform, and consistent regulatory environment. Now, I'll be honest, it's not ideal. Our ideal would have been to completely deregulate the TNC industry altogether and deregulate the taxi cab industry. We didn't get there this session, but I think we will eventually. And so what I thought happened was a good first step to preempt some really bad stuff that's going on at the local level. Now, speaking of bad stuff, we unfortunately didn't see any success on local government debt this session. As many of you know, we have the second highest local debt per capita when compared to the top 10 mega states. We rank very, very high on that list. Only New York has a greater local debt burden among the mega states. So what we tried to do is a series of different reforms, all centered around transparency and accountability. And we had two great bills get 90% of the way through, and unfortunately, they got caught up in one of the committees. But what I think happened this session is a recognition by the legislature that the status quo is quite simply unsustainable. You have the local debt situation, which is exacerbating an already difficult property tax environment. It's adding debt onto future generations that quite frankly, I find difficult to see how it's going to be paid off, especially when you compute into the process these exotic public financing devices known as capital appreciation bonds. And so you have a really difficult environment. Unfortunately, the legislature didn't act this session, but we got so very close that I was definitely encouraged by the progress we made. And I think next session, we're going to finally get some local debt reform that has some teeth and that also offers a measure of transparency. One of the biggest issues I think we face right now is this challenge of an uninformed voter. When you, as the general public, go and say yes or no to a ballot proposition, what you're given are two pieces of information. One is the principal amount to be voted on, and the second is a real short paragraph of legalese that's written so broadly it can be applied to anything. That's not enough. People need to know the cost of what they're voting on. And so what I was really encouraged to see, and where we got really close this time, is adding one piece of information to that ballot proposition. What is it going to do to your taxes? I think with the inclusion of just that one simple item, we could change how people see this local debt issue. Now, on the issue of defined contributions, of course, there was a lot of movement on public pension reform this session. specifically targeted at Houston and Dallas. But of course, we tried to use that as a much broader, or tried to initiate a much broader conversation on the sustainability of our defined benefit pension plans. For those of you who don't know, we have about $66 billion in unfunded liabilities as of January 2017. It's probably much, much higher than that because that's using some very generous actuarial assumptions. But even still, $66 billion is nothing to sneeze at. Part of the problem, and what's at the heart of the problem, I think, is the defined benefit system, which makes promises irrespective of how much money is on hand. And so what we encouraged the legislature to do, specifically in the Houston and the Dallas cases, was to look at more of a private sector solution based on a defined contribution, which is more closely akin to a 401k. It's basically what 95% of the private sector has in place now. I believe that's a CNN survey statistic. Now, we didn't get there, but in the case of Houston, we at least were able to bend the conversation in a way that they installed a hybrid. They said, okay, Houston plans, you guys are in pretty rough shape. If you get worse, then there's going to be an option for the installation of a cash balance plan, which is a hybrid between a defined benefit and a defined contribution. So we didn't get to where we needed to be, but we made a little bit of progress. So that badge should actually have an asterisk by it. In the case of Dallas, you know, I'm a little bit more down on that particular scenario. I think taxpayers are really getting put in a bad position in that particular plan. But there's going to be a lot more movement on the public pension front because you have a lot of systems that are in bad fiscal shape. And I think a lot of the chickens are coming home to roost. Unfinished. So of course, there are two of our biggest items this session were property tax reform and annexation reform. Real quick on annexation, very, very simple issue, and it's a little confusing as to how this actually is allowed in Texas. But basically what's allowed is if you live outside the city limits, a municipality can annex you without your consent. They can come in and say, hey, Joe, you are now a part of the city of Austin. Welcome to our tax-paying club. That's without your permission. And so what we did is we said, well, you know, there may be a better approach here, guys. Instead of allowing for involuntary annexation, let's reform the process so that people have an opportunity to vote. Let's let people actually participate in the democratic process and decide whether or not they want Austin city governance over them. Now, that's an argument that I think carried weight with both liberals and conservatives, and actually got about as close as you can humanly get to being achieved without getting vetoed. The conference committee report was filibustered in the Senate after already being approved in the House, and we were this close to getting it done. Now, on property tax, of course, there's an idea floating around the foundation that property taxes should not be allowed to increase uncontrollably. I think we've grown to a position now where property taxes are extremely elevated. They are hurting people's ability to invest, to afford their home. It's becoming a very big problem. And so one of the issue sets that we put forward is this idea that property taxes are already elevated, and they really only should grow by a certain percentage before you allow the public to weigh in and say, you know what, yes, that's okay if you grow above 4%. Or no, it's already too high. Let's find a different way around things. And so we got this pretty darn close as well. Where I think we have hope is that later today, the Texas governor is going to call a press conference at 2:30. I am 99% sure that property tax reform is going to be included on that call for a special session. On the annexation front, I'm about 50-50. I'm hopeful, but I'm not too optimistic. I think it's an issue that could easily fit within the scope of the property tax reform. There are a lot of property tax implications within that. And so I know I'm out of time, but I'm happy to take questions later. With that, I want to introduce our next expert, Stephanie Matthews, who's our brilliant leader of education.
Brilliant. Get your hopes down a little bit. But I appreciate the compliment. I was a little intimidated when I sat down and everybody had pages of notes, and I had my little notebook here, like, I can't decide if that's good news or bad news. I felt so intimidated. I made some notes, so I did bring them up here, so I will make sure I continue to follow my notes. I think the reason that it was good news and bad news is that we were focused on a singular issue, and I guess I need to change my PowerPoint. Oh, that's your visual.
I had the next one too.
Well, I only have one visual. I continue to get outperformed here. So my name is Stephanie Matthews, and I am here to represent the Center for Economic Freedom. I love my job. I love what I do because at the end of every day, my singular focus is on the kids of Texas and what is best for the kids of Texas. And it really sort of uncomplicates all the policy issues, even though the policy issues are very complicated. And they're certainly not controversial, which I'm sure most of you in this room know. They are very controversial. But again, if you really break it down to its most simple form, if you really focus on what is best for the children of Texas, the solutions are not complicated. This session, again, which is why my notes are short, we focused on a broad but extraordinarily important vehicle that we believe strongly is the best avenue for children to be educated the way that not only parents believe they should and could be, but sort of unstructures what we believe to be an overly complicated system that, again, doesn't focus on the kids, it focuses on a system. This session, we focused on promoting education freedom, of course, but education savings accounts. So I'm going to go ahead and pull these bullets up because they really are all related. First, I'd like to note that around the country, and we as proud Texans, and I'm looking at all these signs about enterprise, liberty, freedom, we look at this map. There are 36 states that have 61 school choice programs in this country. Texas is not one of them. That's unacceptable to us. And at Texas Public Policy Foundation, 27 years ago, there was a gentleman named Dr. Jim Leininger, who many of you might be familiar with, who came up with the concept that at the end of the day, these are our tax dollars, these are our children, and parents know best how to educate their children. Maybe they don't know specifically, but they know if their needs are being met or if they're not. So the concept is simple. Our tax dollars, parents should have the opportunity to choose, in every other realm in Texas, we certainly have this opportunity, to choose what's best for our children. That is the concept upon which the Texas Public Policy Foundation was created. So we've been fighting this battle for quite some time. We will not give up, and I'm thrilled to say, what's next? You'll hear me say this again. We will not give up, and we did get farther this session than we ever have been. Having been in this movement in different arenas for multiple years, I won't tell you how many, but I remember how old I was when the foundation was started. Anyway, we got farther this session than we ever have, and so we are very enthusiastic about what comes next. So what is an education savings account or an ESA? Once again, the concept is relatively simple. We pay tax dollars, the dollars follow the child to a school, and the concept here was let's unbundle and allow parents, if they could take just a portion of the dollars that would go to that particular school, it would go in their control, and they could choose different ways for their children to be educated. That is the simple concept. If you think about a health savings account, we're all familiar relatively with HSAs. This is not dissimilar. There would be dollars that would be under the purview of the comptroller, and there would be accounts created for children. Parents would be issued a debit card of sorts that would be very limited exclusively to education purposes. So you wouldn't be able to buy televisions, which is a common misnomer. They would be restricted, they would be audited by the comptroller, and again, very limited. And so parents would be able to take that card and use it for, all children learn differently. I only have 2, and my God, they couldn't be more different. And so I would love the opportunity to be able to say, I would want to customize my kids' education, right? So I wanted to do virtual schooling for half a day and then supplement with field trips or tutoring or therapies. One of the most vocal communities we've had in support of this concept, despite what many folks say or what you might read about in the media, is parents of children with special needs. Every child is different. My goodness, the special needs community is about as diverse and vulnerable as you can find. So imagine the power that could be given a parent who could say, I'm going to do part-time virtual, and then I've got this type of therapy, they are accredited and again monitored by the comptroller. And that unleashes power that we have not yet seen in Texas. And we find that unconscionable. So what happened this session? ESAs were the concept. If you follow politics or education at all, you will likely have read that we have a huge champion and continues to be a huge champion in our lieutenant governor, as evidenced by the fact that this session, Senate Bill 3, which that's further down than 1 or 2, but that's pretty darn close to the top in terms of what he said was his primary focus. So we had a tremendous amount of support from the lieutenant governor. And we as TPPF and the education team and our leadership and the coalition worked very well and strongly with the lieutenant governor to help get that message out, and also to the members. We had an interesting start with the House. When the House Public Ed chair, shortly after he was appointed chair, proclaimed that any school choice vehicle was not going to make it through his committee. So that's where we started. The Senate Bill 3 made it through the Senate, had some limitations, made its way over to the House where it stalled. The House said, one of our primary focuses this session, sort of dovetailing with Chairman Aycock last session, is really to fix school finance. They proposed a bill. It was House Bill 21. It was about $6 billion, $5 billion, $1.6 billion proposal to make adjustments and put money back into schools, but there was no school choice. There was no real school choice in there, so they sent their bill over to the Senate, which the Senate said essentially, okay, understand where you're coming from. I might even agree that we do need to put some more money into schools, and so we're going to give you about $503 million if you will agree to this small program of an ESA for children with special needs. And so that was sort of the deal. Now, to put it in perspective, $503 million is not chump change. The ESA for special needs children would have applied to a universe of Texans. 600-ish thousand kiddos would have been eligible. So if you look at traditionally across the country, the number of kids that take advantage of that, it's usually 1% to 2%. So you might have heard that Chairman Larry Taylor's talking about over and again his level of frustration that there was so much vitriolic opposition to what would ultimately have been around 6,000 children that would have been participating in this program. So there was a hearty debate on the Senate floor, but the Senate said, you know what, this is what we believe is right, send it back to the House. And there was a conversation I feel merits pointing out had on the House floor that was telling, and it helps inform what we will do moving forward. There was the scenario I put to you that went back. There were about 6,000 children eligible for this ESA for $503 million. And the chairman of the House Education Committee made a very impassioned speech on the floor saying that this is not okay. We don't like this, it's not okay, which we were all sitting there holding our breath like, oh my gosh, he's gonna kill it, he's gonna kill it. And then at the last minute he said, okay, but we're gonna appoint a conference committee. Right as that happened, there's a gentleman named Ron Simmons, I'm not sure who is familiar with him, he's a representative who is the father of a parent with special needs. He had sponsored a special needs ESA bill in the House that went nowhere. He got up and had this conversation with the leadership and said, wait a minute, so you're saying we can have a discussion about $503 million, but we can't even talk about the possibility of a special needs ESA? And the leadership responded, that is correct. We can't even have a conversation. So they actually invoked a rule that said, this bill can move forward only if we extract the conversation about special needs ESA. Remember, we're talking about 6,000 kids. 6,000 kids in the state of Texas that might have taken advantage of this. That was the decision they made. That's how it was voted. And essentially it went back to the Senate, and the Senate's response could have been, yes, okay, we'll have this conversation with you, or no, we won't. And they said, no, we won't. That's not okay with us. These kids have to be part of the discussion. So, the bad, the bill died. The good, there was more open conversation about school choice, about children, certainly about special needs children, than I've ever seen, and we find that heartening because it gives us so much momentum moving forward. I got 1 minute. I want you to meet Landon. This is Landon Thibodeau. He's a kiddo that we met, mom and dad, found out about special needs ESAs, came to TPPF, introduced themselves, had 4 family members having to take care of their children while they made their way to the Capitol so that they could testify at a hearing on a bill for children with special needs in the House, where we didn't get called up in the House to even start testifying until 12:30 in the morning. They stayed. We learned all about Landon. What Landon's mom said after the hearing and after the bill died was, it is so disappointing because there are 26 schools that are near me that I could drive my son to tomorrow, that I know, and I know the difference in lives they've made in all of the children that go there because I know their parents. And they may as well be 1,000,000 miles away from me because I can't afford it. In a follow-on conversation, because we made a concerted effort to make sure that stories like Landon's are told, I followed up and said, is it okay with you if we use this quote? And she said, yes, of course. I want people to be informed. That said, she said, Stephanie, I almost wish I didn't even know about the ESA because I can't have it. And I've got 26 schools right here that I could access tomorrow. So I want y'all to remember that as we move forward, that there are kids like Landon all over this state, and we need your help, we need your support, and I'm so grateful for y'all being here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Unfortunately, though, coming from the University of Cincinnati, I don't have any baseball quips to warm you all up with. But I can tell you, if you want to talk, we can revisit this during basketball season. I'd be more than happy to address that. So my name is Dr. Derek Cohen. I represent the Center for Effective Justice and the Right on Crime campaign. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what we did during this session, and also talk a little bit about why criminal justice reform is a conservative issue and how it really got started here in the States and in the other states that we work in. So it's commonly asked why. Why is criminal justice a conservative issue? And there are many philosophical reasons for it. You know, we started off as a society with a common law heritage that actually prioritized the victim. We have walked away from that in the punishment of violations of the King's Peace. There's also the community aspect as well. You know, these individuals who commit crimes, they oftentimes end up back in the community. 95% to 99%, depending on how you measure it, will actually be out of prisons in your communities someday. And so that's where we get this interesting policy schism where folks on the left tend to say, oh, well, we're not serving the needs of the offenders. Folks on the right then say, oh, well, we're not serving the needs of victims and communities. And that's where we actually come in saying, what can we do in the criminal justice system that actually serves the needs of the victims, of the communities, and ensures that the offenders will stay as just a one-time offender, and we won't have to deal with that again. So, flash back to 2005. This is a story that I have 6 of my state directors downstairs right now. But this is a story that's almost become a gospel at this point, is that we were getting to a point, both in the terms of criminal justice policy and in state governance, where we actually weren't able to punish the very people that we had to punish. 2005, we were at a capacity crisis that was exacerbated over the interim between that and 2007. In 2007, but just in that interim alone, those 18 months, our prison population went up 2%. This is already at 160,000 people at this time. Went up 2% in 18 months. We were running out of space to actually punish serious folks because we had folks in there that were on technical revocations, on failure on probations and parole. And we weren't using our bed space to the best of our ability. The fiscal note for the reforms that were needed that came out in 2007 basically said, well, you guys, you're at capacity, you need to build 17,000 more beds, and that's going to cost you, about $2.1 billion. $2.1 billion, and that's just for the bricks and sticks of those 17,000 beds. If that was passed into the budget today, that would be 1% of the conferred budget that was just signed off on. So 1% of the budget just to get to the capacity where you can punish the people that you need to be punishing is having a functional criminal justice system. So what they ended up doing in 2007 was to reprioritize how we're using that bed space. Let's take the violent offenders. Let's take the frequent flyers. Let's ensure that there's room at the inn for them. And with the other folk, let's see that for those who are in a safe bet, let's make sure that they are watched very, very closely in the community. None of this, okay, we're going to house them for 6 months and then we're going to let them go with no post-release supervision. None of that nonsense that wasn't very safe that we were doing beforehand. And we'll see if we can actually strengthen the process. And that's exactly what we did. This wasn't necessarily a savings vector at first. I believe the supplemental appropriation for probation alone in that 2007 budget was something on the order of almost $250 million. Now that's a serious amount of money. Of course, that's foregoing the necessary expense of the $2.1 billion. However, after that went into effect, if you look at our prison population going up like this, it teetered and then just went off a cliff. It started plummeting. Now keep in mind, crime rates had been going down before that, but our prison populations weren't going down in lockstep. So making these changes reserve that bed space for actually punishing the people that would violate our communities, that represent danger to society. But we've evolved from that. Other states, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, Oklahoma, some of the junior states, actually have looked to Texas and say, what are they doing there that we can do here? Because they're, especially in the cases of Louisiana and Oklahoma, they're experiencing similar fiscal constraints that we ran into. So we have created the Right on Crime campaign in 2010. We were working almost exclusively in Georgia when we were founded, and now we are in the order of something, depending on your measure, about 43 different states with actual 8 states with boots on the ground people in there. And basically trying to replicate this community and victim-centered criminal justice reform that doesn't rely too heavily on, well, let's just throw open the doors and let everybody out, which tends to be the particular rhetoric that you hear from the left. So in this session, we actually made progress on 3 things that we'll get to. But I want to talk a little bit first about some of the near misses, some of the areas where we could have improved, but some effort was left on the field. And those are 3 areas that I think most people are at least somewhat familiar with, or at least crucially how that works. The first one was the issue of civil asset forfeiture. Now, again, as a center-right think tank, our position on civil asset forfeiture is rooted in property rights and the rule of law. And once you have been convicted of a crime, any sort of proceeds or any sort of gains from that crime then become the property of the state, as it works in nearly all other states in the country. The problem is, though, we don't have that same procedural protection in place. So there was an effort this particular session to actually strengthen some of those procedural protections around forfeiture proceedings. Now, this has nothing to do with seizures, any sort of evidence that's been gathered in pursuing the investigation of a crime. But after everything is said and done, what are we doing to dispose of the property? Are we keeping it or are we returning it? And so there were several bills ranging from, well, let's have a interlocutory proceeding, let's have let's raise the burden of proof to clear and convincing evidence versus preponderance of the evidence, one that actually required a conviction but for X, Y, and Z, and then it listed a couple exceptions in there. Unfortunately, those bills were all heard in a subcommittee in criminal jurisprudence, and only 2 of them were voted out, one of which was pretty strong, the other of which just had to do with rectifying the issue of, I believe the actual case name was State of Texas versus 2015 Lincoln Navigator. You have to understand these parties to the cases are the property themselves, which kind of lends itself to this legal fiction. And so that was advanced. Unfortunately, they did not advance beyond the calendars committee. So that'll be an area that we're going to be focusing intently on in 2019. Another issue that we worked on that unfortunately fell a little bit short in the final days was grand jury reform. You know, everybody says somewhat flippantly, oh, well, you know, a grand jury could indict a ham sandwich. I think it's really hard to get an indictment to stick on a ham sandwich made out of ham after all. But you generally don't see the problems with grand jury reform in certain, prosecutors' tool bags. The bigger issue is the fact that you have these procedural oversights that can lead to people falling through the cracks, that can lead to multiple grand juries being convened on the same fact pattern. All these things are things that need to be patched in our system. So that was another thing we worked on. And then we also have the issue of bonding. Now, bonding is an issue here because at TPPF, we actually support cash bail. The only problem is some of our assessments of cash bail is not based on the actual surety that it's supposed to provide, rather just basically a one-off horse sense assessment of whether this individual in front of us is going to be a flight or reoffense risk. So one of the initiatives that was going through would actually put an actuarial risk assessment to that, so we'd have a better picture of the offender in front of us, and so we wouldn't be holding somebody who was definitely going to show up again simply because they didn't have the money, but at the same time we weren't releasing dangerous people simply because they had the money but might have had all these icebergs lurking beneath the surface when it came to their criminal offending. So enough about the negative stuff. Let's talk about some of the things that Texas has done to increase public safety and to basically lower the burden on the taxpayer. One of the central themes is that Texas has become more responsive to offender risk. Now, while the particular bail legislation didn't pass, one item that has already been signed by the governor is Senate Bill 1584, which actually assigns risk-informed terms of probation. Now, the problem is we have this broad code, and in this code we have something on the order of 28 discretionary terms of probation. In other words, 28 terms that we can assign to somebody that's going to be on community supervision. Now, this could be something from stay away from alcohol or don't hang out with your ne'er-do-well friends. Oftentimes the latter is assigned, rightfully so. But the problem is if you were to sign something like stay away from alcohol, one of the triggering activities that could actually terminate your probation and send you back to jail or prison for a very long time is you having a glass of a glass of wine with dinner. Something that's completely innocuous and not necessarily actually pegged to the offense. Now, if you're a shoplifter, that doesn't necessarily make sense. If you're a shoplifter whose fingers tend to get sticky after you've had a few, then it does make sense. This bill simply just said take a look at the offender and the offense pattern and fit the terms of probation to it. Also, they matched the forgery thresholds to the pecuniary value letter that was dealt with in previous sessions. You had the issue of it being a state jail felony where individuals that were getting caught with forgery for low-level offenses were actually getting carceral sanctions. Meanwhile, the serious level forgers were actually not getting punished to the actual level of their crime. So this simply pegs it to that value ladder and ensures that the punishment fits the crime. One of the big areas that there was a lot of progress in is in strengthening reentry. And that was done through expanding orders of non-disclosure that were passed in 2015. The orders of non-disclosure expansion actually included this time retroactivity. So instead of just being perspective looking, look at these one-time low-level offenses that exist on folks' records, but also it included a provision that allowed for a one-time non-disclosure of a DUI pending no other offenses. That DUI proportion, that was supported by Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They understand that when it comes to getting people re-entered and avoiding offending in the future, what you can do to get the government out of the way of that reintegration is paramount. There was also non-disclosure expansion for Class B misdemeanors and the enhancement of juvenile record sealing. And then finally, And then finally, there was also over-criminalization. You know, there was a talk of the watch bill yesterday. That came from this particular report, this commission report that basically looked at every single law in the books that's not in the penal code and said, what can you land in jail for that isn't actually in the penal code? You know, I just was talking with Brandon. Did you guys know that if you were to if you were to libel or slander a bank, that is a state jail felony? If you are to, oh, it gets worse. If you are to misrepresent the financial health of a state trust, that is a third-degree felony. These are all things that they still have the civil remedies for, and they can get injunctive relief for, but these are things that also have that adjunct criminal penalty. So one of the victories this session was reconvening the commission. There is going to be this commission again next year, and it'll really help move the ball forward on these, you know, laws that they tend to put in books as fun facts. And then finally, I want to say that Texas actually began the process of closing 4 surplus facilities. Since the reforms in 2007 that I opened with, we've actually managed to close 4 facilities already. This last budget earmarked 4 more. And the best part about that, though, is not that prisons are closing, but the fact that we still have the capacity to spare. See, this is the difference between the red line and the blue area. We still have the capacity to spare while taking this capacity offline so that you, the taxpayers, aren't going to have to be hit in the pocket for that. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Brandon Logan.
I'm pretty sure you hit me in the eye with the laser pointer, and that's a third-degree felony.
You'll have to prove a culpable mental state.
I want to thank you for your sustained attention. I'm used to teaching undergrads. I note that everyone is still awake, and most people are not on their phones, so I consider that to be a victory. Unlike a lot of the policy experts before me, I have a job of having to sort of educate a little bit on what I do, because hopefully no one in the room has any experience with the child welfare system. We all have experience with taxes and with property tax, with education, and some of us have personal experience with the criminal justice system. At least tickets, right? But hopefully no one has experience with our child welfare system, and neither do I wish that upon you. And so really, let me tell you how CPS works in Texas. There is a phone call made to the statewide intake service here in Austin. About half of the phone calls, over half of the phone calls in the state of Texas reporting child abuse or neglect are by physicians, nurses, and teachers. There were approximately 800,000 calls last year alone, and so the number has increased dramatically. What happens whenever a call comes in is it's screened by some screeners, and depending on sort of this black box process that no one really understands, an investigator from the state is sent to the person's house to do more investigations. Depending on the level of risk in the home, the child can be removed, and a court proceeding begins for the family. If the child's not removed, if the level of risk is not high enough based on the investigator's opinion, and the child stays at home, then the family's sort of usually given these services to do. Services is something you're going to hear from me a lot, which is government contracted services that really are meant to make you a better person, a better parent, a better, a better person, really. That's really some of their core function is to re-engineer those people we've identified to make them better, because it ends up not being about safety. Then at the end of this court case goes on, the child is in foster care, and during the court case, the parents are given an opportunity to rehabilitate. How do we rehabilitate the parent? Through more services, right? So these are more government contracted services that the parents have to go through. So it's a service plan that's arrived at by the department, that's CPS. A list of services that you must do, that at the end of those services, you're going to be a fit parent and a better person. Every single list of services throughout the state is identical. No matter why your child came into care, no matter what's going on for you, you're going to the same thing. That's parenting, psychological evaluation, counseling. You're going to go attend a visitation, keep a job. They're the exact same services. The problem is we're dealing with very, very different circumstances that bring people into care. I talk about child neglect and abuse rather than child abuse and neglect, and I do that intentionally because we have a neglect problem, not an abuse problem. Child abuse is terrible. Child physical abuse is deplorable. Child sexual abuse is horrible. However, that accounts for about 15% of the reason that children come into care. The other 85% of children in our foster care system are there because of neglect, specifically neglectful supervision. I've had cases where I represented children who were removed. One case in particular I remember, they were removed from their parents because they were in the alley digging through the trash. That's one allegation. The other allegation is that they were playing on the top of a storage building. Those are the two allegations that got these 10 children removed and put in foster care for over a year because they were being neglected. Neglect has a lot to do with our cultural change in parenting. Used to, you could not supervise your children and that was okay. Now, any unsupervised time that a child experiences can be considered neglect, especially if you're in a low SES, right? My children walking down the street, it's a little bit different, but low socioeconomic status children, you know, you want to keep your eyes on your children at all times. So the context for the session was that in 2011, a national child organization called Children's Rights sued the state of Texas and said, your foster care system is bad, really bad. In 2015, in December, a federal court in Corpus Christi issued a 250-page opinion that said, not only is it bad, it's unsafe, to the extent that a lot of the children in foster care in Texas would be better off left at home, where they were being neglected or abused. And the norm in Texas foster care, this is according to the judge, was physical abuse, sexual abuse, suicide, and poor supervision, and psychotropic medication. So that was the background for the session. We came in, this is not a new problem. Texas CPS has been a wreck for decades, and the answer has been, until we entered the conversation at TPPF, the answer has been more money and more employees, such that the number of caseworkers has tripled in the last, the funding has tripled in the last decade. The number of caseworkers has doubled, while the increase in the number of children being seen and treated and managed is increased by 10%. And so this year, at the beginning of session, actually my first day on the job, there was an interim hearing. I went over to the Capitol for this interim hearing, and the legislature was concerned about children not being seen by the department. There were about 2,000 children there's been a call to statewide intake saying this child is at risk of abuse or neglect. And when that happens, the state has 24 hours to lay eyes on that child. There were 2,000 kids the state had not done that to. There were some of those kids where their risk had been identified. Somebody cared enough to make a phone call, but they hadn't been seen for 30 days by anybody. And so the state was concerned, asked the commissioner of the department, what can we do? The commissioner said, we need more money and we need more staff. And out of just a lack of any sort of different ideas, they cut an emergency check of $190 million to the department in October of 2016. That was what was going to happen in January whenever we started. There was going to be a gigantic influx of money into this system. The history of increase in funding and staff in the system is it shows short-term gains. All right, if I gave everyone in here a $10,000 raise, are you going to leave your job? Well, not for the next couple of months, but after that you might, right? And so some of that money in that emergency appropriation had gone to giving every caseworker in Texas a $12,000 raise. So obviously, as we sit here today, people will tell you that the turnover rate in CPS has improved. Well, I can tell you why. They're making $12,000 more. How long does it take before people forget they make $12,000 more than they used to and be equally as dissatisfied with this fundamentally broken system that's ultimately just a broken bureaucracy? So we entered the system. The governor to his credit, identified this as his first emergency item. There was a lot of pressure this session, and we were able to make a difference. I'll get to that in a minute. What I want to talk about is the constraints, and I use that word in a good way. The constraints are this friction, or what is the relationship between family and government, and when should government get involved in the family? I'm privileged to live in a state that cares about that question. We have a legislature that this session wrestled with that question, even in light of recent child deaths and a federal court case that said our system was broken. The governor, in his address, where he led it as emergency items, said, I want children protected, but I also want parents' rights respected. And so we did have some victories, small victories. There's a lot more there's a lot more work to be done in this, which is getting government out of families, detaching those two, and allowing families to flourish. But we had some examples about when the government should intervene. We believe that the government should remove a child only when there's an immediate risk to the child's physical health or safety. Short of that, there are other protections in the community that can be brought to bear on that child. We had some success in CPS was removing children for otherwise legal behavior. So failing to vaccinate, homeschooling, we had that put in the code that said those can't be reasons to remove a child from their parents. I want to talk about this for a minute, because this was sort of a scary session, because I'd never seen this before, this thing called predictive analytics. And that's using government data to try to predict who's going to abuse their children. I'll get some laughs. If I were in a different crowd, people are like, oh yeah, that's exactly what we need to do. I was in those rooms this session, and you should be afraid that this is the sort of the next wave, because this is what's being called prevention. Everyone wants to prevent child abuse, but what's being called prevention is actually this, using government data, running it through a computer, and then spitting out people's names. And then I don't know what happens next. That question wasn't answered, but I'm assuming that someone's going to come knock on the door and say, we're from the government and we're here to help. So we had some due process victories. That's really my bread and butter. My heart is in making the court system better, making the legal process better, because I think that is the key. Now, the big victory of the session is, in my center at least, is that we have devolved foster care from Austin to communities. And the way we've done that is, in each community there'll be a lead nonprofit that will be responsible for providing foster care, providing rehabilitation services, meeting a child in foster care's need. And they'll be able to do that through contracting with people in the community. So we're no longer dealing with a cookie cutter list. Everyone has to do the same services. You can look at the nonprofit will look at the family, the nonprofit will look at the community and match up needs. The good thing about that, the fact that we are connecting those two things, families and communities, is because by and large our neglect problem has to do with a lack of social bonds and social capital. What happens in our current system is we get these services, these government contracted services, and that's what we call social bonds. When do they end? When the government quits writing checks to the counselor, parenting, educator, et cetera. Through this community-based foster care, devolving this to communities, making communities responsible for the care of foster children and the reunification of families, then we're hoping, and I've already told the nonprofits that are starting to apply for this, I'll be their worst enemy if they do this wrong, because I'm going to be following up with this, because this is the most important work and has to be done right. But the state just wasn't in a position to do that. So we've devolved this to the communities. I'm hoping that we can use this model, that we can use this same model, right? Local coordinating nonprofits that are looking at community needs, community strengths, family needs and family strengths, and connecting capacity with need. I'm hoping that we can use that model to strengthen families and build communities. I'm hoping that we can finally start talking about prevention, early intervention and family preservation services without the government's help. Right? We don't want the government to knock on the door and say, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. We want your neighbor to knock on the door and say, look, I've noticed that your child's out front a lot, and if he needs somewhere to come watch cartoons, or if you need some help with child care, we can get that accomplished. Hopefully we have started a cultural change back to neighbors helping neighbors, communities helping families, and away from the government doing everything for us, whether we like it or not. So with that, I really do appreciate your time, and thank you.
Thanks, Brandon, and thank you, panel, for your presentations. How about another round of applause for these 5 great folks? We have a little bit of time for questions, and so the way this will work is we have some TPPF colleagues who will come around the room with a microphone. So if you're interested in asking a question, please raise your hand. I will recognize you and then recognize the next person in the queue so we can be efficient. And also, please phrase your comment in the form of a question. Otherwise, the chair reserves the right to move on to the next person. Okay, microphones ready? Staff? All right. Go to this gentleman right here in the front. Just wait for the microphone, sir. And next person, right over there in blue shirt. Yes, sir. Make it good.
I'm Bill Swinney. Bill Swinney from Bastrop area. I have 2 questions.
We'll take the first one.
Number 1 being, were there any legislative victories that we can brag about? And number 2 being, 4 of you 6 speakers, according to the document here, hold doctorate degrees. How'd you manage to get this far in education and stay conservative?
That's it. You know,
Most professors, the more degrees they get, the stupider they get.
you're right about that. You know, that's a second question I can believe in. So thank you. Yes, I'll field that one on behalf of the panel and say very carefully. So fortitude is a cardinal virtue. On the first question, I think we brag about the conservative Texas budget. I think we brag about what's going on in foster care reform. We would brag about what's going on in criminal justice reform. And we would also brag about some moral victories, getting education freedom very close across the finish line. According to our metrics, farther than it's ever gotten. We think it is going to happen at some point because we're on the right side of history. And I can tell you that what's going on in local governance, we can brag about, even though we didn't walk away with some victories. I don't see him here now, but Chip Roy, who's now heading up our federal work, or a lot of our federal work, would brag about the Convention of States. So we believe that in addition to these policy changes, the federal government's got to be put back in its box. By whom? By states, by us. Thank you for those questions, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Tom Camardo from Travis County. I have a question for Ms. Matthews. You spoke a little bit about school choice programs throughout the country, and you mentioned specifically ESAs. I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the future to school funding solutions here in Texas? Is it exclusively ESAs? Is it a hybrid? And what's your vision?
Sure. So first of all, I think we're all in agreement. There's no silver bullet to education, and that is explained very specifically. Every kid is different. Every community is different. Everyone's needs are different. We see ESAs as one of the most liberating to parents because it truly allows the customization of a child's education rather than a real specific role. So that's why we favor that, because again, it truly empowers the parents to design an education that best fits their child. There are successful school choice programs all over the country, and even many traditional districts are embracing choice within their boundaries. In Travis County, AISD has responded very well, slowly, but very well to a lot of the competition that charters in particular have brought to the district. So there are new models being opened across AISD. There's single gender models, there's STEM models, there's expansion of models that are currently successful. So no one silver bullet, but we believe that folks are responding to the pressures that are being brought to bear in states that offer choice programs. Traditional districts are responding. Academic outcomes are improving because they are responding to the pressures that competition is bringing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Vance wants to
Vance
step
would
in.
also like
Thank
to
you,
step
Stephanie.
in.
Just like to say one other thing. When you talk about school finance, we've also testified a couple times that the ultimate way to make a more efficient tax system is to eliminate property taxes so that property taxes aren't funding schools. And then direct those dollars directly to parents so they can best meet their child's needs. So that's a more longer term goal, but it's something that we're continuing to work on.
All right, all the way in the back there, and then Bill. Gentleman here in the third row. He'll raise his hand again.
I'm Walter Bradley from Georgetown. It seemed that in this session, there were some very good bills that died that had majority support, but because of some of the procedures and the way things get done, they die in committee, they can't get voted out, and I'm wondering if there's any possibility of them changing the process, because I do think that a lot of the impediments are not for lack of majority support, but for political manipulation that's allowed by the rules. In fact, it's even enabled by the rules. Is anybody looking at changing that? Because it seems to me that there's a lot of power in a few people's hands who are assigning the committee chairman and so forth, and good bills go there to die.
That's an excellent question. I think a very fair one, and I'll field that, although I know that my 5 colleagues are ready to jump in and offer their opinion. It's our foundation's position, number one, that we will leave the sausage making to others. But I can tell you, speaking as one of the organizations of influence in Texas, you're right. And I would encourage people in this room for whom that's news to look a little more closely and do what they need to do as private citizens to correct that wrong. We're not going to do that because of the nature of our mission, but I can tell you, Georgetown citizen to Georgetown citizen, that I hope you do that. Let's see, Bill is next there.
Yes, Bill Kilroy. I'm from Williamson County, and my question's for James Quintero. But first, I'd like to chime in for the Mustangs. And but I'm a 6th-generation Texan. It's interesting. When I was 10, 12 years old, I used to throw a .22 rifle on my shoulder and go hunt rabbits. How would that? We see how we treat something like that today. It's unbelievable. But the taxing area is a nightmare. James, I'd like to understand what our strategy is for addressing these constant myriad of adding all of these taxing entities that are out of control. SMUDs, SUDs, ESDs, reinvestment zones, transportation zones. It seems like every legislature, they add more instead of getting them taken away. And these aren't cities and counties. These are all of other taxing entities that are really bankrupting our people.
You talk about pushing James's buttons. All right, James, go.
Well, Bill, you're absolutely right. So there, for those who don't know, there's an area of local governance that's often referred to as invisible governments. These are special purpose taxing jurisdictions. And these will either levy a property tax or a sales tax, and they are very, very numerous. And there are approximately 40 different types of these special purpose districts, and they cover everything from basic infrastructure needs to financing football stadiums to doing things that cities ought to be doing, like police services. And so they run the gamut. And what I think you're getting ready to see the foundation do is because this is really a universe unto itself, is do a deep dive and figure out which of these entities we can establish sunset provisions. Where is it appropriate to say, okay, after the establishment of this particular taxing jurisdiction, where can we just phase it out? So that it's not effectively on autopilot and doesn't continue to add to the burden. So that's one thing that we're going to do is really take a deep dive and look at where, especially on those entities which provide services that cities ought to be doing or perhaps have become duplicative, really figure out how to get rid of them and phase them out. The other thing that we're going to do, and I think you're going to see this within the next 90 days is my hope, is establish some property tax reforms that apply to special districts. And just to give you an idea of how numerous these things are, I believe the latest report from the Senate Research Center quantified them somewhere north of 2,500. So, I mean, these things are everywhere, and especially if you're in Harris County, you have a lot of special purpose districts with their hands in your pocket. But one of the things that we're getting ready to do and push for is to apply the trigger, the property tax trigger, to special districts so that their revenues grow more slowly unless they receive an affirmative vote from the public. And I think that will do some to mitigate the excess property tax. But you're absolutely right. Special purpose districts get created every legislative session and then they're forgotten about, except by those small few who control the board. And so there's some governance issues there that I think need to be addressed too, looking at where we can possibly extend, move from appointment to an election process. I think that will help some, but you're right, Bill, it's a very big issue.
Thanks, James, and thanks for that question. We'll take a few more questions. Gentleman up here in blue blazer. And then over here, yes, Stephen. Right there in the fourth row, Amy.
Bill Moran, Austin, and for either James or Stephanie, what progress or what have we done with regard to appraisal, public disclosure on appraisals and fairs? Because I know that like certain school districts have to give money to the others. That's the structure of the finance right now. And so if those other counties or other areas are underappraised, it means more to these other places. So what's going on with that stuff?
So if you look at the bill that came out of the Senate, there were a lot of appraisal reforms attached to that measure. I don't know that any were really moved in the House. But for us as a foundation, and I definitely understand the disclosure issue, for us, the emphasis has been more on revenues. How many dollars are coming in through the door, and then how can we establish a trigger so that those dollars don't grow excessively? And so our focus and our emphasis, particularly in this coming special session, will be on the revenue side of the equation. But I think we may see some appraisal reform too. I don't know that we'll see full sales price disclosure, nor do I believe that it's probably a dicey issue around here as well.
Thank you. Stephen.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Dards. It's questions for the whole panel. I guess we're assuming that the special session is going to happen, so I was wondering what issues would you like to see the special session called on?
Property tax, annexation reform, school choice, spending limit reform, franchise tax. Any others?
We'll take grand jury too.
Grand jury reform. Brandon says he's comfortable where we are. We can move forward.
He wants to go home.
Yeah. That's a great question to conclude on, because I was going to say in less than 90 minutes we will probably have the answer to that question as Governor Abbott is hosting a press conference. You know where we stand on that, and of course it's his right, and we trust him with that on our behalf. A couple of things as we close. I hope that what you heard this afternoon was evidence of how we decide to get involved in an issue. Is it the right decision based on our principles? Is it good for the people of Texas? And is it a hard fight? Because if it's a hard fight, then it's the right thing to do, and it's transformative. And that's what we're going to keep doing on your behalf. Thank you so much for being here. If you like what you saw, come back during the interim. Join us for policy orientation, too, in early February 2018. Thanks for being here. God bless Texas.